Hello everyone. Today we would like to talk about chapter 13 about saving, investment, and the financial system in the United States. So let's look at some questions we try to find the answers in this chapter. First one, what are the main type of the financial institutions in the US economy? And what are these functions? Then we'd like to talk about what are the three different kinds of savings if we talk about the economy as in the aggregate level. Okay. So next we would like to talk about what is the difference between saving and investment. Pay attention here, saving and investment we will talk about in aggregate level. So those savings and investment is not like a personal investment or personal savings. Then we'd like to talk about how does the financial system coordinate saving and investment. And last, we would like to talk about how do government policies affect saving, investment, and the interest rate. Okay, so those are the questions we try to find the answers in this chapter. Now let's first begin with the first one: financial institutions. So do you know the definition of financial institutions? Financial institutions is actually financial intermediaries. So those institutions you can, as a saver, like households, okay, they can indirect provide funds to borrowers. So for example, if you have extra money, you can put it in your saving account, right? And then the bank, they will help you to indirectly lend the money to the people who need it. So bank, or we say commercial banks, we can treat it as financial intermediaries or financial institutions. Another type of the financial institutions could be mutual funds. So for mutual funds, we treat them as the institutions that sell shares to public and then use the proceeds to buy portfolios of stocks or other bonds. So for example, once you graduated, if you sign a contract with the employer, then your employer probably will provide some part of your salary or additional money into your 403k account. Okay, so for 403k account, then there are other, we say mutual funds companies like Fidelities. They can help you to invest your money. Okay, to use your money in the 403k account to buy their portfolios of stocks and bonds. Okay, so Fidelio, we can treat it as a mutual funds company. And let's look at now the different type of the savings. Here, pay attention when we talk about different type of the savings. We just consider domestic market. We didn't included the foreign markets. Therefore, we were not involved any imports and exports when we talk about GDP or like when we talk about savings if we just focus on domestic market. So here we only have this is what we already learned from chapter 10. Y represents for GDP including four components, right? But if you just focus on domestic market, then you will have three components: consumptions plus investment plus government spending, right? So first, let's look at what is private saving. Okay, so what private saving is? Private saving. Private saving equals the proportion that households income that is not used for consumption or paying tax. And as we talked about before, income will equal GDP, right? The aggregate income will equal GDP. Therefore, the private saving here will equal income, subtract consumption, subtract tax, right? This part will be the private saving that are not used for consumption, not used for tax. So this part is what we call private saving. Y subtract T subtract tax, or Y subtract tax subtract T is similar, okay? Then for the public saving, public savings comes from government, okay? Comes from government sector. So for government, where can government get income? Government's income comes from tax, right? And then this tax we treat as the revenue of the government. And then what is the spending of the government, which will be government spending, right? So this part we treat it as public saving. So we use the tax revenue subtract the government spending. Therefore, we will have this part as public saving. Then let's talk about national saving. So national saving will be just the summation of private saving and public saving. So national saving is just the summation of private saving and public saving. We can use this formula, okay? So we have the private saving is Y subtract T, right? We use the aggregate income subtract the income tax and then subtract consumption. This will be our private saving. Plus, government saving will be the tax revenue subtract the government spending. So finally, we will have Y subtract T subtract C plus T subtract G. Okay, we just eliminate all the parentheses. Okay, so here you can see we have subtract T. Here is plus T, right? So these two parts can cancel. When you canceled, what left? Y subtract C subtract G, right? So this part we treat it as our national saving. And you can notice national saving always use a big S. Okay, always use this big S to represent. So big S here we mentioned is the proportion of national income that is not used for consumption and not used for government purchase. Then go back to check this formula here, okay? Go back to check this formula. You might find some connections. So just look at these two formula. Look at these two formula. You can notice when we just consider the domestic market, we have GDP, including the three components, right? Consumption, investment, and government spending, right? So here, if I ask you, can you derive for investment? Then you probably would have investment will equal Y subtract C subtract G, right? From this part. From this one, you can also derive for investment, right? Investment will equal GDP subtract consumption subtract government spending. And then you can also notice that we just compute the national savings, right? The national savings will also equal income subtract consumption subtract government spending, right? So actually from here, it obviously will tells you in a domestic market or is it in a closed economy. In a closed economy means there is no international trade. In a closed economy, we always have investment equal national saving. Okay, investment equal national saving. So here, if we consider the open economy, okay, we have four components, right? Consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. However, in a closed economy, we only consider three components: consumption, investment, and government spending. Then we can solve for investment, right? As I just solved here, we have the investment here just equal Y subtract consumption subtract government spending. And that's exactly equal what we have here from national saving. So we will have national saving or equal investment in a closed economy. Okay, national saving or equal investment in a closed economy. Understand? All right, now let's look at another concept, which is the budget deficit and budget surplus. So I bet you probably will hear those two concepts often, okay, from maybe the economic news, business news, okay, or like business information. So budget deficit and budget surplus comes from public saving, okay, comes from public saving. If public saving is positive, if public saving is positive, which means government will have some extra money left, right? So if public saving is positive, then we would like to say government has budget surplus. However, if public saving become negative, which means you spend more than you collected, then the government will suffer a budget deficit. So budget surplus means there is an extra tax revenue over government spending. So we have T minus G become positive. Okay. However, for budget deficit means now government spending exceeds the tax revenue, right? So we will have G subtract T help us to compute budget deficit. Okay? Or you can see the budget deficit. So the budget deficit here will equal negative T minus G. Okay? Because it's negative, therefore we just uh, get rid of this parenthesis. We will have G minus T to get the budget deficit. All right. Now let's look at one practice questions about how to apply private saving, public saving, national saving, budget deficit, and budget surplus. Let's look at this example. Suppose now the GDP equal $10 trillion. Okay, consumption equals $6.5 trillion. Government spending 2 trillions, and it has a budget deficit of $300 billion, which it will be zero point 0.3 trillion. So from those information, can you compute the public saving, taxes, private saving, national saving, and investment? Okay. So how to solve this type of question? You just need to apply to what we have learned. Okay. For the, we just need to summarize some informations here. Okay. I'll just write it down. We have total GDP, which will be our Y, right? Equal $10 trillion. And then we have consumption here equal $6.5 trillion. We know the government spending will equal $2 trillion. And this economy also has budget deficit. So budget deficit is G subtract T, right? As we just learned, equal $0.3 trillion. So the first one asks you to compute public saving. Public saving is actually negative now, and then it will equal budget deficit. So we only have negative public saving, right? Because this economy suffer budget deficit, so it will equal negative zero point 0.3. Okay, negative zero point 0.3. And then now let's look at finding the tax. We have this budget deficit equal zero point 0.3, right? And then we know government spending equal 2, therefore it will easier for us to get the tax yield just equal G subtract zero point 0.3, which will be 2 subtract zero point 0.3, and then that will be $1.7 trillion. Okay, so this $1.7 trillion will be the tax. And then now, how about the private saving? Private saving will just equal, as we just mentioned, okay, from previous slides, we use the GDP subtract tax and then subtract consumption. The rest will be private saving. So we have the GDP equal 10, subtract tax 1.7, and then subtract consumption 6.5. Okay. So finally, we will have 8.3 subtract 6.5, which will be $1.8 trillion as consumption, as the private saving. Now, how about the national saving? National saving, I will just write it down here. Okay, so national saving will equal private saving plus public saving, right? And then we already have the private saving equal 1.8. However, the national saving is negative, right? Plus negative zero point 0.3. So finally, we will have the national saving will just equal $1.5 trillion, right? And the last one asks you to compute investment. From previous slides, we know investment will just equal national saving. Okay, so we will say this one, these two equal to each other, 1.5. Or you can also compute investment to verify if this 1.5 is correct or not. So how to do that? Investment would just equal Y subtract consumption, subtract government spending, right? This is from a closed economy. So we will have Y equal 10, right? Subtract consumption, 6.5. Subtract government spending, $2 trillion, which will still equal $1.5 trillion. So you can see, you can use two ways to compute investment, right? Either you can directly use the national saving, which we just computed, or you can use this formula to compute it, right? It will still equal 1.5. So still this practice question, we just verify that national saving will equal investment in a closed economy. Understand? Okay, now let's just move on to talk about how a tax cut might affect saving. How a tax cut might affect saving. So let's look at this information. Use the numbers from previous practice question, okay? But now suppose the government cut the tax by $0.2 trillion, okay? So this is the government policy. How the tax cut will affect the government spending. All the things will be still the same, okay? And then we just need to write it down. Previously, we have the tax, as we just compute, is 1.7 trillion, right? But now government cuts the tax by $0.2 trillion, which means now the tax is no longer 1.7 trillion. The tax now, the new tax will equal $1.5 trillion, okay? So these are the new informations. Okay, we still have the GDP equal $10 trillion, government spending equal $2 trillion, consumption equal $6.5 trillion. But now we have tax cut. So new tax, okay, new tax will become $1.5 trillion. To each of the following scenarios, okay, please determine what happens to a public saving, private saving, national saving, and investment. So we'll look at two scenarios. The first one, consumers save all their tax cuts. Consumers save all the tax cuts, which means now, if consumers save all the tax cuts, what happens? We will have the private saving still equal Y subtract tax, subtract government spending, right? And then Y equal 10, subtract tax now 1.5. So it's not subtract consumption, okay, and then subtract consumption because nothing changes in consumption, right? The government, it means that consumers now save all the tax cut, which means the consumption will be still the same. We'll make the private saving now equal $2 trillion, $2 trillion. And then we notice this $2 trillion is higher than before, right? Before we just have $1.8 trillion, but now we have $2 trillion. Now how about a public saving? Public saving will be more negative, right? Because government didn't cut the government spending. However, it cut the tax. Therefore, the public saving will equal tax, the new tax subtracts government spending. So we use 1.5 subtract 2. Now the budget deficit increased, right? Budget deficit increased. Before it's just 0.3 trillion, but now we have the budget deficit as $0.5 trillion. How about the national saving? National saving is just the summation of private saving and public saving. So you need to sum these two numbers. I just write it down here. Okay, so we have the national saving still equal to subtract zero point 0.5, right? Which is 1.5. And this will also exactly equal to investment. So what happens? You can notice if government have tax cut and then consumers save all the tax cuts, consumers save all the tax cuts, we know the private saving will increase. However, the national saving and investment will be exactly as the same as before. National saving in the previous practice question is still also equal 0.5, $1.5 trillion, right? And now in this new tax cut, if consumers save all the tax cut, nothing will be changed in the national saving. Okay? Let's look at the second scenario. Consumers save one-fourth of the tax cut and spend others. Okay? Spend the rest of them. So what happens now? Consumers save one-fourth of the tax cut and spend the rest of their tax cut. So now what happens to the consumption? We will have our new consumption. The new consumption here will equal original consumption, right? Plus three-fourths of the tax cut, right? So this will be the new consumer consumption, okay? The new consumer consumption. And then let me just write it down. It will be okay. So the new the new consumer consumption here will equal 6.5 plus 1.125, which will be will be 7.625. Okay. So this will be the new consumption. The new consumption here will equal $7.625 trillion. Okay. Now what happens to the private saving? So private saving now equal income subtract tax, right? Subtract new consumption. Okay. So we have $10 trillion, subtract new tax will be 1.5, and then subtract the new spending, personal spending or the consumer consumption, 6.72 or 7.625. Okay, so this will be 8.5 subtract 7.625. Okay, so now we have the private saving will equal so we have the new private saving will equal 0.875, okay? $0.875 trillion. Now let's look at the public saving. Public saving will still the same, okay? So public saving will be like government spending subtract, tax subtract government spending, which will be 1.5 subtract 2, still negative zero point 0.5, right? Okay, now let's look at the national saving. The national saving now will equal to the summation of private saving and public saving, right? So we use 0.875 plus negative zero point 0.5, which will be 8 point, 0.375. Okay, so this will be the new national saving, the new national saving. How about the investment? We can just verify if our calculation is correct. Okay, so the investment here, I'll just write it down. The new investment will equal GDP subtract new consumption subtract government spending, right? So use 10 subtract 7.625 subtract $2 trillion, okay, in government spending. So here we still have 0.737 0.37275, okay, and this is exactly from the national saving that we compute by summing private saving and public saving. Okay, so you can notice if the government have the tax cut, consumers save all the tax cuts, then nothing will changes in national saving and investment. However, if now consumer change the saving patterns, it has some allocations with this tax cut. For example, save part of the tax cut and spend more, then it will definitely affect national saving and investment. Okay, so let's move on. Any questions about this part? I bet through these calculations you can have better understanding about how to applying those formulas to compute private saving, public saving, national saving, and investment. All right, now let's just move on to talk about the meaning of savings and investment when we talk about macroeconomics. So here, private saving is the income remaining after households paying their tax and consumption. This is why we use Y subtract tax, subtract consumption, okay, to get a private saving. So, for example, there are some ways that households can do with savings. Households can buy corporation bonds or equities. Okay, consumers can purchase a certificate of deposit at a bank, like this certificate of a deposit will be have certain periods of holding. So, for example, you need to hold this certificate for 6 months or for 1 year, and then after 6 months or 1 year, you can get your money back. Okay, so this is what we said a certificate of deposit, or buy shares of the mutual fund. You can also buy the mutual fund shares from, for example, Blackstone or like the Fidelity, and that accumulate in saving account or checking account. This is what typically the consumers would do with with their actual money. Okay, just put it in a saving account. However, we know the interest rate will be really low. Okay, now let's look at for investment. So investment here means the purchase of the new capital. This investment in macroeconomics is totally different from the investment in financial markets. Okay, and then what is the new capital? This new capital is not stock or bonds. Okay, the new capital here means probably will be the new factory, new equipment, new equity. Okay, so for example, GM spent $250 million to build a new factory. It should be the new factory. Okay, or you buy $5,000 worth of the computer equipment. So this is new computer equipment to invest in your business. Or your parents spend $300,000 to have a new house built. So you still notice this investment here, as we talk about in chapter 10, it should be business fixed investment, including the new factories, new equipment, right? Or like the residential fixed investment, like the third example, spend $300,000 to have a new house built. So this is the residential fixed investment or inventory investment. Okay, so keep in mind in economics, investment is not the purchase of stocks or bonds. Now, previously, here is just some summation. Okay, previously we have the Y here equal total income equal GDP, right? We have C represents for consumption, G represents for government spending. and I represents for investment. T represents for tax. We have the investment to equal GDP subtract spending, I mean for consumption and the government spending, right? And it also equal private saving plus public saving. So I here investment will equal national savings in a closed economy. Okay, so this is just the summation of what we have learned. Now let's move on to look at the loanable funds market. So this will be a different part of this chapter. So for the loanable funds market, if we talk about market, then you should have supply and demand. Okay. So we will use a supply and demand model in this financial system, and it will help us to understand how the financial system coordinated with saving and investment, how government policies or other factors might affect saving, investment, and interest rate. So we will still use the supply and demand model in the loanable funds market. Assume there is only one financial market. Okay, assume there is only one loanable fund market, and all the savers deposit their savings in the market. All the borrowers they take out loans from this market. Then there is only one interest rate, which will be both the return to the saving or the cost of borrowing. So you can notice now we have the demand side, we have the supply side, we also have the price for the loanable funds. For interest rate, we treat interest rate as the price for loanable funds. So for example, if you put money into the bank, you can get a return, right? You can get a return for the money in saving. So interest rate will be the price for loanable funds. And for savers, like the households, okay, interest rate can be treated as the rewards for saving. For borrowers, interest can treat it as the cost of borrowing. So like other prices, interest rate might increase or decrease, right? So when interest rate increase or decrease, it will definitely affect supply and demand for loanable funds. So let's look at what we have in the loanable funds market. Okay, you can see we have the goods in the loanable funds market, which is the loanable funds. We have the price for loanable funds, which will be interest rate. The supply from the loanable funds will be the savers, like us. We put the money into a saving account. And then we also have the buyers for the loanable funds, which could be the borrowers, like the firms and corporations. They need to borrow the money from a bank for their future or for their current investment. Now let's look at households. Okay, households will have actual income that can loan it out and an interest. For public saving, government part, okay, if it's positive, we know positive public saving means there are actual money or left for government, right? So if national saving is positive, it will add to the national, if public saving is positive, it will add to national savings and increase the supply of the loanable funds. If it's negative, then it will just reduce the national saving. So let's look at the loanable funds market. And you can notice if we treat this one as the market for loanable funds, the supply curve for loanable funds will be positive. Okay, it's just like what we have learned before. You can see we have the quantity on horizontal axis and price, that will be the interest rate on vertical axis. When interest rate is 3%, only 6 billion loanable funds will be available in the market. However, if the interest rate doubles to 6%, then the loanable funds will be more available in the market. So we would like to say an increase in the interest rate will make savings more attractive, which will also increase the quantity of loanable funds in the market. Okay. Now, for the demand of loanable funds, the demand from the loanable funds will come from investment. So, for example, firms can borrow money to buy the new equipment, right? Households Like us, if we want to purchase a new house, we probably will make a mortgage, right? So households will borrow funds if they need to purchase a new house. New house is part of their investment. Remember, contributes to residential investment. So the demand of the loanable funds, we can predict it should be downward sloping, right? So we still have quality of the loanable funds on horizontal axis and interest rate as the price for loanable funds on vertical axis. Okay, so the demand for loanable funds could be downward sloping because if the interest rate decrease, it will encourage consumers or like us, okay, or the firms to borrow money from the bank. So you can see once the interest rate is 7%, 50 billion loanable funds will be demanded. However, if the interest rate decrease to 4%, then more loanable funds will be demanded, like 80,000 or $80 billion. Okay, so a decrease in interest rate would decrease the cost of borrowing. Decrease in interest rate would decrease or reduce the cost of borrowing, which will increase the quantity of loanable funds demanded. So very similar to what we have learned in demand and supply model from the microeconomics, right? Now let's look at if we have demand side, we have the supply side, definitely we can find out equilibrium interest rate, right? So for the loanable funds markets, we will just only have one asset, which will be loanable funds. And then the demand for loanable funds comes from investment. The supply from the loanable funds come from savings, national savings, okay? And the price for loanable funds will be the interest rate. All right, now let's look at the graph for this. So you can see we have demand side, we have a supply side. Once the intersect point will be our equilibrium point. Okay, so we see the interest rate actually adjust to make the demand and supply become balanced. So in this graph, we can find out the equilibrium interest rate at 5% and equilibrium quantity will be at $60 billion. Very similar to what we have learned before. Now let's look at something. If you can look at if the interest rate decrease, if the interest rate decrease from 5% to 3%, then there are more people would like to borrow the money, right? However, there are fewer funds will be available in the market. So the interest rate can help the equilibrium interest rate can help the market to adjust demand and supply. All right, now let's look at some policy changes. Government sometimes will have the policy changes, right? And then how these policies will affect saving and investment or the interest rate. So let's see. If the government provide a tax incentive for saving, for example, if you put your money into the bank, then those type of money can exempt from tax. This is a really good deal, right? So if households know that, so okay, if put the money into a bank saving account, they that type of the money can exempt from tax, then they will increase their private saving, definitely. So it will increase the supply of the loanable funds, which will shift the loanable funds supply curve from S1 to S2, and which will result in a lower interest rate, right? Lower interest rate and more loanable funds will be available in the market. So that will be the first type of policy, tax incentives for saving. Let's look at if government provides some tax incentive for investment. So now if government has the policies like firms, if you borrow money from the bank, then the borrow money can exempt from tax. This could be a really good deal for firms and corporations, right? So definitely they will increase their demand for loanable funds. Once they increase the demand for loanable funds, it will shift the demand curve from D1 to D2, and which will result in a higher interest rate and more demanded for the loanable funds. So you can see the new equilibrium point will result in higher interest rate and more loanable funds. Now let's look at a practice questions regarding to this part. Budget deficit. If the government has budget deficit, what will happen to the loanable funds market? Let's look at this one. It says use the loanable funds models to analyze the impact of the government budget deficit. It give you some steps. The first one, draw a graph showing the initial equilibrium, and then determine which curve will shift when government runs a budget deficit. After that, please draw the new curve on the diagram and analyze what happens to the new equilibrium, interest rate, and loanable funds market. Okay, so let me just follow the steps. Okay, first I will put the interest rate here. Okay, because interest rate now is the price for loanable funds and the quantity Q on horizontal axis for loanable funds. Quantity for loanable funds. Initial demand and supply. I just randomly draw. Will be demand curve D1 and this is a supply curve S1. They intersect at one point, right? And this point will be the equilibrium points. I put point A here, okay, as the equilibrium point. So point A here, I have the interest rate. I put R1 and then the quantity is Q1. So that will be our original equilibrium points. A is our original equilibrium points. We have interest rate at R1 and equilibrium quantity initially at Q1. Now government runs the budget deficit. How budget deficit will affect which curve? Budget deficit. I just write it down here, okay? Budget deficit means now government has negative public saving, right? Means the public saving now become negative, and which will definitely reduce the national saving. So it will definitely reduce national saving. So we have the national saving will decrease. So when national saving decrease, what happens? We know the supply of loanable fund will decrease. So result in supply of loanable fund decrease. Supply of the loanable fund decrease, which will shift the supply curve of loanable funds to the which side? Left hand side, right? So shift the supply curve of this loanable funds to the left hand side, resulting in the new equilibrium points. I mark this part as point B. Okay, this is the new equilibrium points, and then you can find out the new equilibrium interest rates and equilibrium quantity. So just writing down the new equilibrium point at point B, we have the new interest rate which will increase, right? And then we also have the new equilibrium quantity for loanable funds, which is decreasing. Okay. So you can notice a budget deficit will reduce the national saving, as I just said, reduce national saving and then reduce the supply of loanable funds, which will result in higher interest rate and lower quantity for the loanable funds. Okay, so this is what we talk about the loanable funds market. Now finish two parts of this chapter. Now let's move on to the last part of this chapter. Inflation and interest rates. Actually, this part is just some reflection of what we have already learned in chapter 11. Okay, so inflation and interest rate. We talk about when we talk about interest rates, there could be two type of interest rates, right? Real interest rate and nominal interest rate. And then I already told you we will more focus on real interest rate. So real interest rate is the interest rate already corrected for inflation. We already learned this one, right? And nominal interest rate doesn't correct for inflation. We also know there is some relationship, right? There's a formula for us to correct the real interest rate from nominal interest rate, which is the Fisher equation. I just give you the name now. This is the name for the equation that we correct for real interest rate. So the facial equation will make the real interest rate. I'll just write it down here, okay? The real interest rate, this is what we already learned, would just equal nominal, would just equal nominal interest rate subtract, right, inflation rate. We already learned this equation in chapter 11, but at that time I didn't tell you the name for this equation, and this equation is just the facial equation, okay? So this is the facial equation. Real interest rate will equal nominal interest rate subtract inflation rate. And this graph, show it again. You can see the blue line here shows the nominal interest rate, right? The orange line here shows the real interest rate. The differences between these two curves will be the inflation rate, okay? So I think this is the end of chapter 13, okay, when we talk about saving, investment, and the loanable funds market. Very important, okay? Because in the following chapters 16 and 17, we will still go back to check the loanable funds market, okay? Thank you so much.